Welcome to Questions We're Afraid to Ask. We are back again. Today's question is mine. I have a question. It's what does the uprising of the Joe Rogan Experience tell us about the changing landscape of media, I guess? And so the reason I wanted to talk about this is I sort of had a moment the other day when I was sort of had this, like, it's so strange that I was noticed how many times Joe had been mentioned in the news that day because of things that had been said on his podcast. And I was like, man, I remember when this was just like the dumb podcast that I listened to 10 years ago, and sort of had this moment of like, okay, things have really shifted here. And how have they shifted in that? So
I know you have a list, but there's a couple of points I want to hit before we hit that. To give some historical perspective, right? We started with the town crier, right? That's kind of how news was spread, orally, verbally, because nobody could read. Then we had the Gutenberg press was invented, and that eventually turned into cost-effective printing presses, so we got newspaper, right? And then more people were able to read, and we got newspapers, and so we had that. And then newspaper turned into AM radio, and then television, and then when I was young, when I was born, it was AM radio, FM radio, TV, and movies, and newspaper, and magazines, and that was it. And so that's kind of like that's where I grew up with. And then you got a bunch of more contemporary lists. Yeah,
I did as well. And really what I was sort of looking at was the sort of the shift. I guess it's the last shift that I'm looking at, which is the shift from television to
from the stuff we grew up with,
whatever this is now. You know, because if you go back again, like you said, we go from nothing to everything's on paper, and then everything goes from then everything's on paper, and we add audio, and then we add video.
Yes.
And those all three things continued to happen. But now it feels like we're seeing the decline of words only, of just paper.
Well,
that's
and
starting to go away.
The other bit is with each edition, things became more accessible to more people. Like, as we added paper, then we added audio, then we added video, because the things we absorbed them with became less expensive and over the airwaves type thing. So it became more accessible, because it's easier to send an AM radio signal or a TV signal than it is to send a paper to someone.
Yes.
Like,
yes.
So
very much so.
This has been a technological advancement in spread and accessibility of information.
Very much so. So I had ChatGPT help me make a list real quick.
That's
of
something
this.
we'll talk about later.
I love it's so handy as this sort of thing. And so it goes through some early internet stuff. It mentions that like Napster was founded in 97, but they were just doing DVDs then, which I do remember.
Netflix, not Napster.
What did I say? Sorry. It's the Napster's the next one. Netflix was just doing DVDs. And I remember at the time them talking about how at that time the United States Postal Service was the largest internet provider, just by the data that they were transmitting through the mail on DVDs was more than like the whole US's internet usage or something.
Part of why it was so seismically shifted was the cost of buying DVD movies wasn't bad, but buying DVD television series was massively expensive. And so now we had an easy way to get that so we could watch what we wanted on demand.
Well, and what's actually interesting about that, if you really sort of think about it, the DVD and Netflix sort of almost happened at the same time. They were very close to each other in that sort of it finally became feasible to mail it, because
you couldn't mail a VHS tape,
terrible,
right? Yeah, the weight and the cost
expensive.
And stuff.
Yeah, and they probably would break easier, honestly, because they were so big.
And by having a warehouse inventory that is mail order,
Right.
You didn't have to deal with the cost of the physical footprint of like Blockbuster Video or
Right.
any of the
And
other video
so
stores.
Netflix, then we go Napster in
The downloads,
99,
downloading
iPod,
music.
iPod
Mm-hmm.
in '01, then Apple launches their iTunes store in '03, which was
Yeah.
sort of the first digital marketplace kind of thing like
And
that.
on that, I can remember when Apple became the number one music retailer, displacing
Yeah.
Walmart. And
They
that was
were
a drastically huge market shift
I
because we
do.
went
I don't
from
that was many years later, but I
it was
remember when
several
that
years later,
happened.
but to go from like the physical retail giant, and for those who are
Mhm.
young, Walmart's electronic section used to be like 3/4 CDs,
Mhm.
and it was just racks and racks and
Remember
racks of
when
music.
Best Buy was
Yeah, it
like
was like that
seven
too.
gigantic rows of
Yeah, but being able
and
to
there were
get it
whole
digitally.
stores in the mall that were
Oh yeah,
just
there was the
wall to
music.
wall CDs. So, all
Yeah,
right, so iTunes store in '03, then YouTube is '05. And
yeah.
then the next year, which I didn't remember it was that quickly, the next year Google stacks them. So it's
Well,
2006.
because I remember it took off, people were figuring it out, and Google
Yeah.
dangled a ton of cash in front of the developer's
I
face, and
didn't
it
remember that
boom.
it being that quick. I thought it was like 2 or 3 years.
Well,
I didn't
I
remember it being
think
that.
Google bought it before Apple could.
That might be true.
That was
Then
it was whoever could pull the trigger on the cash fast enough.
and so then the next year, Netflix goes streaming.
And I remember when that happened
2007.
because I remember when Netflix first launched at 2007, 2008, 2009, the categories weren't like necessarily, or one of the categories that we no longer have was by like what channel it was. You could click on the History Channel. You could click on like Disney. You could click on, because they had everybody.
On
So
Netflix?
yeah, you could
Oh, I don't remember
filter
that.
by, yeah, it was they only had it for a couple of years, but you
Hmm.
could kind of filter by certain channels. And
Yes, I do remember that. Yeah.
because you didn't necessarily click on documentary, you would click on documentary history, documentary discovery, and they had some sub filters that don't exist anymore.
So then 2008 Hulu launches.
Yeah, I remember that.
2009 Joe starts his podcast.
And I remember
At
people
the
talking about podcasts in that
it
time and
was
not really
he
understanding
was
what it was.
he was really early. I mean, he wasn't the first, but he was in that early adoption period.
Yeah.
And I've heard him talk about it and on his show and on other people's podcasts about how like people were like, what is he doing? He's like, I don't
Mm-hmm.
know, I'm just having fun. Like his idea was sort of the same thing that we're doing. Like
Yeah.
you and I are going to have this conversation one way or the other. We might as well record it and let people listen to it if it's interesting to them. And that's what he did.
Yeah,
Um,
and to touch on this, I know it's jumping forward a tiny bit, but the cost to do this now and start it up is minuscule compared to when
Absolutely.
Rogan did it. So it's again more accessible.
Well, and to be fair to Rogan, when I was listening, they started with one webcam on a computer.
Yeah.
So like it really wasn't a
Well, what I mean
crazy
by
entry.
some of the digital tools, like
Perhaps
the video recording and the editing and the time that went in and stuff.
he was just live streaming them and posting. So like again, he was literally doing it as
Yeah.
cheaply as possible. What does so
But still,
2009 Spotify goes on. That's
Mhm.
when that starts. 2014 we get Prime Video. 2015 Apple. Let me just finish this. Apple launches their music streaming service. 2020, this is what it calls out. During the COVID-19 pandemic, usage of streaming platforms surges,
Yes.
further cementing the dominance of digital audio and video content on the internet. In the same year, Spotify signs an exclusive deal with Joe Rogan for the experience.
Mhm.
And that's where it stops because
and there's
doesn't go more than that.
some other things that happened in there, and some of it was
Yes.
pandemic wise, right? And this is what's leading to, and we're recording this July 14th, 2023. The date is only important because some of the stuff that
actors
happened
went on
during
strike.
I was going to say during the pandemic have led to the writers Guild strike and the
Mm-hmm.
actors strike, and I didn't really understand why they were striking. I mean, I knew there was money involved, but then watching a show like Breaking Points, which is something that we'll get into down the line, um, they mentioned that the medical insurance you get through the SAG, the Screen Actors Guild thing, is tied directly to how much money you're pulling in. I think it's yearly. It's either monthly or yearly. And with the residuals being all messed up from streaming, now people are starting to lose their money because of the way the contracts are and all this kind of stuff. So all that ties together. There's so
Yeah.
much more involved in this now than just the transfer of information. It is disrupting industries.
And I think part of what's going on here is you've got, again, there's a shift in media. I look at my kids.
Mm-hmm.
So 7 and 13. He's too old. And they don't, it's interesting. We talk about how much it's just real quick video, stuff. And I think what happens is people get caught in that and they get stuck. But I actually noticed that what my kids watch is some of that quick stuff, but it's actually, they're watching long form podcasts as well. They're just watching three guys who are all playing a video game together, and they're all talking and yelling and having a story while they but it's the same thing I'm watching, which is two guys in a room having a conversation. They're just also playing a video game, and they're not talking about
the
DNA.
subject matter
they're talking,
is different. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's geared to, so it's at this time where I feel like everyone's concerned about how attention spans are dropping, and I think that's happening, but I think it's targeted by those applications. I'm seeing me and both of my kids all shifting to this. I want a long thing that just sort of plays and I can listen to and I can be engaged in.
And that ties into what James Wright was talking about when we interviewed him. And if you haven't watched it, go back and check out that episode. It's fascinating because he's a very successful YouTuber, and he was talking about like what does YouTube call it? Is it reels or shorts or snippets?
YouTube is
or
shorts.
But these 1 minute ish videos, right? These 30 seconds to 90-second videos. We'll
Shorts.
just call it in there. These shorts, right? And I'm noticing with my 18-year-old that he's coming to me asking me questions about news stuff. Like he's getting the bulk of his news from shorts. The difference is he's not then clicking and watching the whole thing. He's coming in asking me. He hasn't made that next logical leap to say The Hill Rising, does a short, and then he clicks on that and he watches it and he goes, "Did you hear about the thing?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I watched the 12-minute video." And he's like, "What 12-minute video?"
Right.
And then so it's fascinating because the way I'm going to do 3 generations. So the way my dad got the news, because he had to leave for work so early in the morning, is he left before 6, picked up the paper on the way out, got to work, and then had some downtime before they start. They'd punch in, and then they had 30 minutes before they all got their work orders and drove out. And he would sit down and have 2 cups of coffee and smoke a cigarette and read the paper, right? And by the time he'd gotten the 2 cups of coffee and 2 cigarettes done, he had read what he was interested in the paper. And then that evening he would come home and we would watch the news. We would watch the local and the national news at 6 and 6:30, right?
So finish up with your dad.
So that's my dad.
So my dad, hang on.
Go ahead.
So my dad he got the paper. So we got the Chronicle from
we
Houston
did too.
in the
The
morning.
Houston Chronicle, yeah.
And so I remember my dad would read the paper. Sometimes he would take it with him He
Mm-hmm.
would take like the front page with him because I would always read the comics, so I didn't care. So that would sort of disappear. I know he listened to NPR in the morning in the car because he drove from downtown Houston to Clear Lake every
So
day.
he was
So
listening
that's
to an AM
and
radio
he was
station.
listening
Yes.
to an AM news station that the
Mm-hmm.
NPR usually, I think, is what he listened to for 45 minutes. I mean, you catch
Yeah.
the news and then they'd have a show or whatever. I'm not 100% sure. And then I remember that we would have the news on in the evening, ABC, NBC, whatever the
Yeah,
local.
the local, not cable news,
I,
because
I,
that
I
didn't exist
remember it
yet.
being
Yeah.
Tom Brokaw most of the time. Like that's
Yeah.
who I remember seeing.
Yeah. And it would vary, but we would watch one of them, right? But we
Mhm.
always watched Channel 13 news. We always watched Channel 13 for the local, for Marvin
Yeah,
Zindler,
same here.
right?
Yeah,
Marvin
same
Zindler,
here.
Eyewitness News, Slime and the
Yeah.
Ice Machine, and that whole thing.
Yeah.
And sorry, guys, that's a Houston thing. If you don't know it, look it up. He's fascinating. That man was fascinating. He's one of the only news people that I know that got a lifetime contract and signed it fairly early.
And let me add real quick before you jump to you. I also do remember that my parents and at least my dad would watch like the PBS NewsHour as well.
Okay, that's interesting because we never did. We never watched any.
Well, that is a more left leaning news
and
report.
My parents didn't look left or right for their news because at the time, prior to the launch of cable news, I feel like, and I could be wrong, but I feel like the mainstream 30-minute local news and the 30-minute national news was fairly center and wasn't really left and wasn't really right because it was required, right? It was a requirement. Every station had to do it. All, the big three, they had to do it. They weren't making any money off of it. They knew they had to do it because it was required. So
it was a law.
And we also had journalistic integrity was a much stronger thing because I grew up in the generation right after Cronkite, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those Tom Brokaws and stuff. They still had that like newsman quality where when they said something, you trusted what they were saying, or at least they were giving you the best information they had with as little bias as compared to like what I see nowadays, where they feel like opinion shows and they're talking and screaming at each other and all that stuff, right?
Well, that's cable.
So that's yes,
Yeah,
yes. And some of the Sunday morning talk show stuff too.
and those
there was a bit of
that.
that.
And I think
my mom got her news
I think
differently.
those got hostile after cable made it
Yeah,
popular.
I agree. But my mom, because she wasn't a stay-at-home mom, but she babysat kids for the first part. She would watch her news by turning on like Good Morning America or one of those, and they would do the little bits of the news, and then they, I remember that being part of her routine.
I actually have no idea how my mom got her news.
Mm-hmm.
If I had to speculate, I guess she watched the news in the evening, but I don't because I went to school.
That was
with
a
her
family
in the morning.
thing for us. I don't know if news at night was a family thing for y'all. Because it was usually during dinner, and now I know we have completely different experiences when it comes to the television in the house.
The TV on.
But the way my house was set up, we didn't have a dining room or anything like that. It was one of those long, thin kitchens. What do they call them? A galley kitchen with with like a spot for the table at the end, and then as you walked out, you came into the living room, and it was kind of open concept because we had a bar where you could look right through the kitchen into everything. So we'd sit down for dinner, and they'd turn the news on, and we'd watch the news while we ate dinner.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I am. We'll get into it later. I don't actually remember a lot of the details about when I was a kid stuff, and it's part of the aphantasia. We can talk about it another one. But so I don't remember. I do remember the news being on some, but not so much.
And then I remember the launch of the cable news shows, specifically CNN, and then followed by CNN headline news. So the way I've consumed news as an adult has changed. What I used to do was I would wake up and I would turn on CNN headline news. And for a long time, that was my favorite news source because I actually fell in love with it before on audio before I did on visual, because the school, the university that I went to, Texas Lutheran, had a little AM station in town, and it was hard to get. We were in a kind of a dead zone for radio in general, but that was a strong one. And at the top and bottom of the hour, they would run CNN's like 8-minute headline update where they just hit all the stuff, and it'd be like, and this is the news brought to you by CNN. We'll repeat again, right? So I got used to that. And then I'd turn on the headline news, because I knew in 15 minutes, because that's how long it ran before it repeated, I could get what was going on, right?
Right.
I could get what was going on. And if something broke, they would break in, like something drastic happening. And I remember this clear as day. September 11th, 2001, getting up with my wife at the time, my ex-wife, and we were both getting ready to head to work, and getting up and like putting the coffee on and stuff, and sitting down on the couch and turning on the TV, and it would come on. I mean, I had it set to come on to that cable thing, and looking at the TV and going, man, what is this, like a special effects for a bad movie, or a trailer for a bad movie? Because it hadn't clicked. I was still in that
There's
wake-up
a
fog.
cognitive dissonance there for a second.
Because it was also the first plane, and they had no idea what was going on.
Right.
And it took a minute for that. So that we're going to do a whole show on that later.
Well, and let's take that for a second and jump, because like, imagine what that would look like now. Like, when that happened, you caught it on the news. I was at school.
Well, and
I was in high school.
Something amazing happened for like the next week or 2 weeks too.
Well, hang on. So then someone came in and told us.
Okay.
The principal came in and was like, "Hey, a building just hit one of the towers in New York.
Or a plane just hit one of the towers. Yeah.
Sorry, hit one of the towers in New York, and we don't really know what's going on. We'll let you know." And they because I was at a small school. We were in essentially in a house. They just came upstairs and told us.
So they did to you what they did to Bush, because he was like reading to kindergartners. I remember that.
Right. They just sort of came in and told us what was going on. We were like, okay. And then they came in and were like, all right, there's a second one. Everybody should go home. And they sent, everyone had cars. They got us all out of there. Yeah. Honestly, because I was at a private school, one of the kids there was like an embassy kid. And so I think they just,
because public school did not shut down that day.
No. Well, and my dad got sent home because he was worked in aerospace with NASA and stuff. And so they were like,
they sent all those people. Yeah.
Because Ellington, his office.
Because the rumors and stuff that were flying around all later that day were like crazy.
I remember. Well, and I just came home and turned on the news. I mean, I turned on the radio in the car. No, I didn't, because I didn't have a radio in my car. So I just drove home wondering what was. I had the thing. I didn't have radio. So I just drove home, probably just no idea what was going on. Happy that I was out of school at 9 in the morning, and then went home and turned on the news and just stared at the TV all day,
Yeah. So some other interesting things happened that day. The place that I worked at, I was doing tech support at the time. It was before I went to grad school. I worked for about 3 years in the real world before I went to grad school. And one of the computers I had, because of the kind of support I was doing, had a TV tuner card in it. Because I was supporting a lot of that legacy style technology for our education contracts and stuff that we had for the company that I worked for. And the building we were in only had like 2 break rooms, and it was a call center, and we were getting 0 volume. Like, there were a few calls that came in right as the shift started, around 8-ish. Central Time, and then it just all died out. It all died. Everybody was stuck on the news. And so only so many people could fit in the 2 break rooms, because they were tiny break rooms. And I remember having that, and I turned it on, because I normally only ever did it for troubleshooting purposes. But my manager actually, because they could see the rabbit ears, they knew that it was at my desk. It was like, does that work? I was like, yeah. And he's like, turn it on. Because my manager's dad was in one of the towers, and he couldn't get a hold of him. Like you just kept getting the busy signal. Like lines are overwhelmed, lines are overwhelmed, lines are overwhelmed. And we didn't mean to turn this into this. But anyway,
Yeah.
we all crowded around this little computer with the TV antenna,
Yeah.
right? And then like after the second plane hit, they're like, all right, everybody go home. We're not going to get any calls. You're going to get paid. Just go home and try and contact your loved ones.
Yeah.
And make sure everybody's safe. Do the things you need to do. And here's where something amazing that stands out to me happened. I remember getting in my truck, turning it on, and I was planning on reaching over and hitting the AM button. And it was because it was on 93.7 KLBJ Classic Rock in Austin, and turning the key on. And as I was reaching over, the AM people were on.
Yeah.
They had stopped all the music on the FM station.
And they were just playing the news.
And it was just the news. And I was like, wow. And then just to check, I hit like 2 other buttons, and it was everybody. And for like the next week to 10 days, there was no music. There was just news on the radio, AM and FM, right?
Yeah.
So
I do remember that.
And that's what I wanted to take out of that. That was kind of the point I was getting to, is this entertainment thing we had, boom, news, constant news, because this crazy thing was happening.
Right.
And that was a drastic event. And then it played over and over, and it was everywhere. And they cut in, and all TV stopped, and it was just everything. So that was a massive media event. And I remember that because it strikes me the way I hear my parents talk about how JFK struck them, or where the moon landing struck them. So that was that kind of moment for me.
It was, I when that happened, I remember the school assignment being go home and ask your parents about Kennedy, because that was sort of the previous national tragedy that.
But
so, and that's
what I never thought about it. What I never thought about doing that day was turning a computer on to try and get the news.
Yeah, and so I was going to say let's flip this forward from that to, I don't want to get into anything specific, but all of the riots and things that happened in 2020.
Yeah. So we move forward to smartphones. We move forward
because there's cameras everywhere, and there's a million ways to disseminate that information, and instantly. Yeah. And and what's happening is we stopped. News got too fast with cable news. They started to speed that process up and get things out quickly.
But there was the scoop aspect of it, right?
There was a scoop aspect of it, but they still had hours, maybe days before they could but we've gotten to the point where now it's they can't even wait to check.
Yeah. And we've seen that a lot. We've seen that with everything from school shootings to individual shootings to like robberies to, an accident or an explosion.
To things that happened at, all the riots and things that happened. There were things that happened that didn't happen that were reported as truth.
Absolutely. I can think of the train derailment that happened not long ago. There was a lot of all kinds of stuff. And to be perfectly honest, sometimes that's the only way we can get any information out. If you go back and look at the first 3 months of the Ukraine war, we were getting everything off of Twitter, right? Twitter videos, Reddit videos, right? Uploads to the internet. That's how we were figuring out what was going on.
And I want to now sort of shift this to where this change of, I think it happened during COVID. I honestly think it happened because of COVID.
I think it was happening, and COVID turned it up
maybe
30.
Supercharged. Maybe COVID just supercharged this shift, because it feels like there was before 2020, there was mainstream media,
and it was
waning.
It was waning, and it had cracks. but it was still dominant.
And I think it was still trusted in a way. Like
Yeah,
you could,
like
I mean,
there was skepticism, but nothing so crazy that we were like, I just don't believe you yet.
now
Right?
there were people who were very adamant that Fox News was a bunch of crazy people even before then, because I know some of those people who were still just
And
like
people who were like, said the same thing about MSNBC or some
MSN,
of the
right?
but people would
But I think
say we trust the three big, the ABC, CBS, NBC, and even to a point Fox, not Fox News, the local Fox affiliate
but
type
even
stations.
PBS and NPR
PR, yeah.
and all those places, and then we have this shift during the pandemic when people were told what they could and couldn't think and what they could and couldn't say, and it got a little nasty,
And you couldn't ask a question, right?
and I think the big turning point, for where I saw it shift was when, and to take it back to Joe again, which is where we started, was when Joe had one of, he was either the first or second COVID guy he had on,
Mm-hmm.
who was saying like, hey, this isn't what, and I just remember those guys. I remember listening to those because we were all starving for information, like, because nobody knew what was going on. And I remember in the early days, I was terrified because the
Yeah.
news scared the shit out of me. Like, they were, people are dying and you're going to die and you better be careful because they're going to fucking kill you.
And I
And there
remember
were no
early on,
solutions.
like you and I got into an argument about masks specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And it came because I was listening. I was still having to commute in the hour drive in, and I listened to talk radio on the way into work, mostly for the traffic. Right? This was, and again, I use my phone with maps now and stuff, but I would listen for the traffic report.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember them having a guest on to talk about masks specifically to try and deal with some of the bad information. I don't like the term misinformation. The bad information that was going out about some of these masks, because
Right.
during COVID, everybody suddenly became a mask sales company and started making masks, right? And I remember him saying, none of this works unless you're wearing at least an N95 rated mask properly fitted to your face. Everything else isn't stopping COVID
Right.
because the COVID molecule is small enough to get through the pores in the
Right.
mask. And he said, and I even remember
heard
him
it was
saying something
described
like,
a
it
trying
might
to
help
use
with
it.
the flu or it might help with the
Mhm.
cold, but not COVID. And he
Yeah.
said, and these people wearing the face shields with no mask are just stupid because what did they think? The air stops and doesn't go around it, right?
Right.
And I remember thinking, that's interesting because I was wearing a bandana because it's all I had early on because you couldn't get masks to go to the
Right.
grocery store because you couldn't go into the grocery store without some kind of protection over your face.
Face covering. I
Yeah.
remember.
And I remember a lot of schmogs wrapped around people's faces and a lot of bandanas and stuff because we just didn't know any better,
We didn't
right?
know. And there's all, I mean, I remember early on the discussion being like, well, it's on the water droplet, the moisture droplets, and the
Yeah, and
moisture
I'm not
droplets will
blaming
get stopped. No. And it just,
anybody in the
like,
really early days, right?
it was so confusing. And so where I was going with this is like, I was, and I say now, I'll use the word captured. I was captured by, hang on, by the mainstream media,
Yes.
MSNBC, CNN, and the rest of them.
But very
And
early on, the only counterpoint was like AM radio. That was the only counterpoint, right?
so there came a point when, I had stopped listening to Rogan for a while, but I remember sort of in the pandemic around that time, a little bit before, like picking it back up again. I'd
Well, we
stopped
were
maybe
starved
for a
for
year
media,
or so.
right? We were starved.
Yeah,
We were
probably.
starved
I was
for
bored.
content because everything stopped. So,
And so I started listening so I started listening again. And so I remember when he had one of the COVID people on, and I was like, oh, thank goodness. Like, I can learn something. Cause I mean, he has amazing guests on who teach us amazing things. I've read more books because of that show
yeah,
than
I have too.
anything else. And and so I sat there and listened to it, and I was like, okay, well, I know a little bit more. I have a little bit more information about what's going on now that this scientist has explained it. And then I remember seeing the response and going on the media going, okay, that's not right. And so that was sort of that break
And
from
I also remember some of those scientists on who were called to testify before Congress, and the congressional hearings were posted on YouTube and other places and got pulled immediately and said this is
because of
misinformation. So
misinformation.
literally a expert brought before Congress because they're an expert testifies, and not only was the content getting pulled, people's channels were getting suspended, strikes, demonetized channels, all kinds of stuff was happening to
Well,
the point some
and there
people
were
just
people who
stopped
got
doing it. They're like,
pulled
we're
off Twitter and
yeah.
all sorts of things got happened. People got deplatformed is really
Yes,
in
that was
all
where that
sorts of
term
different
came
manners.
from, right? Yeah.
And so I think now what we're seeing coming out the other side of this is, at least for me.
But there was another big thing, because I remember you calling me and going, "Did you hear what happened?" There was another
which
big
one
event.
was this?
Joe got sick.
Oh, well, I think we talked about this in one of the other ones, but maybe not. Maybe
but I remember that as a seismic shift in your perception of the news.
It was. He got sick, and I remember he tweeted about it that day because I follow his Twitter, and it popped up, and he was like, "Hey, everybody, I'm doing better. I took all this stuff, and he, hydrochloroquine."
And you saw the video from him. Yeah,
and it was his video. It was a post. He looked fine. He was out in his backyard. It was a Texas summer, you could tell, or whenever it was. And so, so then I see it pop up on MSNBC or on CNN.
CNN, yeah.
And they're talking about how he's taking horse paste, horse medicine or whatever.
Horse
and
dewormer.
They show the video, and I went, wait a minute. What happened to, like, it's all looked like garbage. It was all yellow, and
they filtered it.
You can find it online if you search for it. It's out there on YouTube. But he looked, and so I was like, okay, so they are willing, if they're willing to lie about this, they're willing to lie about anything. And again, this is still when I was looking at Joe, and this is after he made the Spotify deal. For me, still, he's just that dude who does a podcast.
Mostly talking to comedians and MMA people, right?
Exactly. Why would you feel the need as a national heritage news organization? It's been around for 40 or 50 years.
I would say if the New York Times was the paper of record for the United States, then CNN at the time was the news organization, the television news organization of record for the United States.
Because CNN was what was in every airport.
It was what started it.
Yeah,
I mean, it was cable news. Yeah.
So I have this moment, and I mean, it's one of those ones that I remember very vividly, as sort of having this and seeing it happen, and having to stop the video and go like, hang on a second. Like, I went back and watched it. I watched it again, and was like, but none of that's true. And like, it wasn't like, the news saying, well, there's no aliens. And I'm like, well, I think you're lying. This was like, I objectively know all of the facts that you have as well, because I've seen, it's all on the internet. We all have access to the same facts.
Yeah.
But I have all the facts, and you're misrepresenting them. So for something that doesn't matter,
I think the reason they ran with it was the ivermectin. And
yes,
the idea that, because at the same time, the new shots were coming out.
Right.
And they didn't want anyone to not go get the vaccine. And so they had to kill someone popular, because I had no idea how many millions of subscribers he had at that point, because I wasn't listening to him, because at the time I thought of Rogan as just a guy who talked to comedians and like meathead fighters. And I've come to realize that is not what that show is. Sometimes that's what that show is, but that's not always what that show is. But they didn't want the
Any
concept
dissent?
of a preventative or prophylactic type medication, so people would think I don't have to go get the vaccine,
Right.
because at the
Right.
time, the I'm going to be very generous here. The government was being told by the people who made the vaccines that if we get the vaccines into people, they will not catch it and not spread it. And we have since
Yeah.
come to learn that that is not factual, right?
Right.
Um,
But pause for 2 seconds. People were ousted off Twitter, off Facebook for saying, and YouTube for saying that.
or
That
even
thing that,
asking a question about it.
that too.
Yeah.
And so it was interesting in that moment to watch them try to cancel him.
Yeah.
Like I had, again, it was a shifting moment of like, the news is trying to cancel my favorite podcast. Why are they trying to cancel my podcast? Like, again, and I used
There was a
the
cognitive
example.
dissonance there.
Yeah. So we were talking earlier. I was trying to think of a good example of someone famous becoming newsworthy and it being strange. And we were talking about Mr. Rogers as
Yeah.
an example. And so, but it ended up being a bad example because he was newsworthy quite often. But that's again what it is. Like, wait a minute. Why are you making Mr. Rogers out to be a bad guy in the news? Like,
Yeah.
he made a statement, but like, why are you attacking him for it? And so, and Joe was such a, again, he's the guy from Fear Factor. Like,
Yeah, he's the Fear Factor guy who does the fights.
He gets drunk and gets high and does podcasts. Like,
And he's
why
a
is the
color
news
commentator
trying
for UFC, right? And
Yeah.
I honestly didn't realize he was a stand-up comic because I had stopped following comedy before he got big, right? And that's, I have since come to watch some of his specials and they're hilarious, right? But I only knew Rogan through Fear Factor and the sitcom he did.
News radio.
News Radio. So I knew him as an actor and the Fear Factor guy. And then he did a podcast and I had heard people listen to him. But I consumed, my podcasts were like unsolved mystery type podcast or UFOs or Bigfoot or, entertainment value, purely entertainment value. I never would have thought of a podcast as a place to go get information, to learn about something or get news from something.
And see, what's interesting that you saying that is that's how I always treated podcasts. Podcasts were always, I very rarely, I mean, I grew up listening to old time radio, something my dad got me into. So I listened to The Shadow and the Bickersons and all these sort of, they would play them on the radio in Houston on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday evenings. But like, they would do a 2 or 3 hour show, and so I'd stay up and listen. They were entertaining. I didn't have TV. I had nothing. All I had was
your
the
parents
radio.
didn't give you TV.
So
I was watching Red Dwarf or Doctor Who, or
I did get to watch Red Dwarf, but yes,
or whatever Star Trek or sci-fi was on.
Right.
What eventually became the UPN network, but that local station that always showed that stuff. Yeah.
And I was staying up late listening to radio because that was what I had.
I figured out the passcode for like HBO and Cinemax, and my parents didn't know, and I didn't go watch Skinemax, right?
Yeah. But what I was that was so listening to story was not something new to me. And so I approached that though, because I remember in the beginning I was listening to I listened to a skeptics podcast, which really tells you where my head was at that time.
Yeah.
And then I would listen to Joe. I remember listening to Kevin Smith in the very beginning because he had one of the early podcasts, which I'm surprised he didn't get as big as Joe did. His was actually good and
I think it was more niche though.
Yeah, maybe. But I always, so I guess Kevin was more entertainment. But again, I liked it because I either appreciated it as an information source, or I enjoyed the two people talking to each other and interacting with that.
I had moved to getting most of my news from AM radio through the drive back and forth to work. And one of the reasons I really love that still is they deal with a lot of very local issues that you
Mm-hmm.
don't get otherwise. And then I had started getting my news almost purely off the internet. And when I say that, I mean like I would go to 5 or 6 different news stations, mostly cable news networks, websites, and then I had an aggregate type site which would feed me it from all over the place. And like world
And
news, local
yeah,
news, top stories, politics, farmers market, whatever. It was kind of a customizable thing. And then I
right.
remember
And
you introducing me to Reddit and like Reddit
mhm.
news or whatever back when it was more news and less just what it is now.
And there is still news there, but
Yeah, but
and
Reddit's in a weird place right now. But
it
that's
is.
that's another
That's a
thing.
whole separate thing. But I think it's interesting to look at, where we are now, because I'm sort of in the same place. Like I go to 5 or 6 different websites. I go to,
Mm-hmm.
I go and look at Drudge because they aggregate as well, and I'll look on there and I'll go, check HuffPost and I'll check CNN and I'll check MSNBC and I'll check Fox News and I'll go check the
Yeah, because I
Bulwark and just sort of poke around and see what I can find. And then the big thing that I do is that anytime I
you
find something that I'm
pull your
interested
mic
in,
pull your mic back down a
anytime
little.
I find something that's
Yeah,
that's
better.
interesting, I'll go ahead and dive in deeper on that. Like, and I think that's the big difference now is that
And
you used to get the newspaper story and you read it and then that was it. And now you read the newspaper story and you go, all right, I'm going to read this. I want to read the source that they're referring to.
and see,
And
I would I was approaching it in a different way for a slightly different reason, and I still do this. I would start with Fox News because I like their layout the best, specifically their
mm,
page layout the best, the way they break down their headlines. And CNN used to be my first, but they changed their website several years ago, and I
it's
hate
got
it
too
now.
many ads on it now.
It's got too many ads, and you never know what's an ad and what's a story, and it's just the way they
Yeah.
lay it out. I don't like it. So I would start at Fox News, and I would find the headlines I wanted to read, and I would go read the articles. Then I would go and find that article on CNN because I kind of considered them kind of middle of the road. And then I would find the same article on like MSNBC or Huffington Post or something like that because I considered them left of center. So I had a right of center, a left of center, and what I considered the middle. And I'd read the same article or the same headline and the breakdown of the article because I figure somewhere in the middle of that is what's
Yeah.
actually happening, as opposed to Fox News'
Mhm.
slant or MSNBC's slant or CNN's slant or whatever. So I was trying to aggregate my own facts
Mm-hmm.
out of the opinion because I do
Yeah.
feel like that we have lost factual reporting and we have moved to opinionated reporting because to me it feels like there's nowhere I could go to watch the news like I did when I was a kid. It
Right.
feels like, and this isn't a dig on this show because I think this show has done amazing things over the years. It feels like all news to me now is 60 minutes because 60 minutes would do an investigative piece and give you a presentation directed toward an idea.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, did your parents ever watch 60 Minutes or any of the
I'm
magazine
familiar.
shows?
I'm
Yeah.
familiar. Yeah.
But they would break something with a way to direct you toward a
Conclusion.
conclusion that they wanted to give you, whatever that happened to be. Um, and I feel like that's news now. And the other thing that's happened is, and how many times have we said this? My God, I click on a headline and there's a paragraph, maybe 2 sentences, and then tweet after
Right.
tweet after tweet after tweet, and I'm like, people are getting paid to do this.
Yeah. Well, and there is a shift. I mean, the idea is, I mean, if Twitter and I guess Threads now
Oh, we missed a huge
are
one.
the public are the public square now,
Yeah.
then I guess what you say in a tweet is newsworthy.
Potentially.
And
But it seems like that's lazy.
That's so strange.
That's lazy writing, in my opinion. I mean, give 3 or 4 examples and then analyze why it's important. And that's
Right.
what feels like it's missing.
Well,
But we missed a giant medium, and I can't believe we did it because it's kind of come and gone. The rise of the blogger, like the amateur journalist, right? I'm sure people still blog, but before Twitter blew up and before YouTube became a news source, there was the bloggers that we would go and read. That was what, from like 03, 04
And
to about
they
like
became
09,
sources for
010.
news.
Yeah, because there were people who were journalists.
So like
You and I
remember,
actually got journalistic credentials once because we had a website that we were blogging.
I
an event.
remember specifically, just to put a point on this. I remember once when a blogger went to Dave Chappelle's show and then like wrote out what he said, and then everybody got all upset about it. It may not have been Chappelle, it may have been somebody else, but like that blogger suddenly became a source.
Yes,
and so I think
and the blogs turned into the vlogs, the video logs, and then
right.
I think that's what kind of killed the blogging. But that happened in less than a decade.
Yeah,
as a medium,
I
rose
think
and
the vlog
fell.
went away. I think the blog became the vlog because it's more compelling. People are drawn to video.
Yes.
And once the video became easy to do, it would have
And
shifted over.
Now we're seeing, post-COVID, we're seeing the rise of what I like to call modern journalistic integrity. A younger group of journalists who are tired of being told what to do, what to say, and how to say it, are launching independent news stations on platforms like YouTube. And two of them that I know of are The Hill Rising and Breaking Points, and I'm sure there's more out there.
Well, and so The Hill is a news website. They've just deployed a news show, which is a libertarian guy, and she's a Democrat, I believe, but I can't remember her saying
one
that
of
specifically.
is right
But she's
of center, the
left.
other's left of center. Yeah.
But I like that he's a libertarian, not a Republican, which is
they're respectful of each other when they talk.
Very much.
Yeah.
And what I like about how they do their show is they will deliver the news. Here's what's going on. Blah, 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 and they'll go back and forth and lay out the whole story. And then she'll go, I cannot remember either of their names, and so I suppose, but she'll give her, and it's not always the same too, but I really like them. She'll give her opinion, and then he'll sort of rebut her opinion, and then she'll kind of go back, and then they'll go back and forth, and then they'll sort of both wrap up their ideas and be done with it. And it's just nice to be like, okay, I know what happened, and sometimes that's all I need. I listen to just that part. I don't need their opinions because I have already got my own or whatever. I don't have time.
And sometimes they just don't give you one. Sometimes you're like,
that's true.
This is just what happened.
This is what happened.
This is what we know right now.
And the rest of that 10 to 12 minutes is just giving you stacks of context. You know, like, here's what's going on, and this guy is this guy who's attached to this dude, which is this thing, and this is, and they sort of lay it all out for you. And I think what's happening is, like, I watched the news the other day. I was with somebody, we were sitting, there's nothing going on, and the news was on. I was just sort of put my phone down and thought, I'll see what's going on. And it was like this and this and this and this, and then this, and then I'm like, but what about the, and I need, and I realized, like, oh, that, it's so fast now that it's,
they've got
all
90 seconds
I have
to 3
is
minutes.
questions.
Yeah. It's like, and this will tie back into the podcast. I remember watching, and because this is a famous interview, the Jordan Peterson interview that they chopped up with the British woman. What's her name? With the
woman from the BBC.
The BBC interview. Yes. The BBC interview that was chopped so bad, and they got so much blowback on it, they had to release the unedited version of the interview.
You're combining two things.
Am I? Okay.
Yeah.
It's been a little while. So
I know. He did an interview with her that was chopped up and put out that wasn't terrible. It was bad. It didn't look good. But then apparently they released the full interview themselves because they thought it went well and wanted to put it out there, and that
Yeah,
backfired on them.
their hit
There
piece
was
their hit piece turned into, oh my god, that wasn't what we thought it was.
right. The
That's what
one
it
that
was.
you're thinking of was the Vice interview
That's right, the
that
Vice
he
interview.
did that got super diced up. And there's actually, again, you can find it on YouTube. There's a video that's both of them at the same time, and it's one all the way through, and then the other it's on the top of it, and the other one is you see it just goes black, and like
Yeah.
it cuts, and you see like huge swaths of answers get cut out.
But
And
I hear so many people have, and I'm using the Peterson one because there's some very easily accessible videos out there if you want to go dig into
Mhm.
this yourself. And then people have strong opinions on him. And then I watch him talk on Rogan for 3 hours, and Joe will ask him a question, and he takes 25 minutes to answer the question.
Yeah.
And the difference is Joe lets him talk.
Yeah.
He may ask clarifying questions during that 25 minutes, but he lets him finish his point, which leads now to the long form interview, right? Which is what we're hoping to do more of.
Which the question is, have we? I mean, we used to have long form interviews,
but did we?
Well, if you think, I mean, I would give the example of the presidential debates that would last for hours.
But they were still set up and cut up and snippety.
But no, but I'm talking about like the 1800s when people would gather and listen to people orate and talk.
We had that.
It's been a thing.
Then it went away, and the only thing that I think ever came close to a long form interview that I can remember in my growing up in development was Barbara Walters. When Barbara Walters would sit down with someone and talk for 25 or 30 minutes or an hour. And that was a big deal, and she didn't do it a lot. But she did it.
Because it would be like, I'm going to sit down on Sunday with Tom Cruise for an hour and have a really
Ronald
long...
Reagan or Bill Clinton or, those kind of things. That was the closest I think we had to what we're seeing now.
And I also think, like, if you think back, I would say maybe not interviews, but I think you also got a lot like the Frost Nixon debates and the interviews.
NPR did it.
There were things in there, but it wasn't normal. It wasn't often.
Yeah.
And I think it was probably more common back when people didn't have TV. And when we go to a theater and listen to someone talk and do those lectures and stuff. But I think what it is that we went from print, which was essentially at that point it was super accessible, at least more than. And then we went
at the least you could go to the library if you had a library in your town and read the paper.
Well, but I meant like if you wanted to get your own information out there.
Oh yes. You could print it. I misunderstood. I'm sorry. I misunderstood what you were saying.
But getting onto TV
was
beyond
impossible.
Local access is almost impossible, especially. And then
there were gatekeepers. There were gatekeepers
so we went from paper, which I guess was more open, to radio, and which was closed, but you could do pirate radio, but that got a little illegal and sketchy, and
there's another aspect to radio that for a while we had CB and ham radio and that kind of stuff to spread information. Now it was a more niche community, but that was Twitter before Twitter was a thing. That was social
the
media
early
before
internet.
It was it was the early social media. Is the best way to describe it.
That's true. And so what's happened now with the internet is it has democratized the access to the viewer. And
and I would take it a step further. It is the cellular-based internet, because there's cell towers almost everywhere, right? That
cellular.
Yeah.
Yes. I was thinking cells, and I was trying to figure out how you're making that analogy.
But the fact that I can connect to a cell phone tower and pull data has been seismic in how all of this changed.
Yes. But I think the ability to get things wherever you want has changed what it is. But I think also it's just like this. This is so accessible that anybody
Yes.
can do this now. Even to the level of like building yourself a studio with a couple of cameras, like isn't insane anymore. You could probably build a rinky-dink studio with cameras and a couple of mics for 4 grand, like if you really, really wanted to.
Or honestly,
Probably
less. I
less
mean,
than that.
we could probably go down to, there's a discount computer store
Yeah,
here in town, and for $1,000 or
get
less,
cameras and mics, and then
we
I
could
was
probably get.
including like
Yeah.
buying a curtain to hang and
Well, I mean,
like,
look
but
how we have it set up. We
I know.
literally just set up in a room with our backgrounds, and we're doing this,
Right.
right?
But I mean, but again, so we've reached a point now. I remember it being 5 or 10 years ago, talking about how we made movie making accessible to you don't have to have a
Especially
super
with
8
like the
camera
green
anymore.
screen built into
Everybody's
things
got
like
a
iMovie and stuff.
yeah,
Yeah.
and everybody's got a
And
phone
and
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 and some of these phones are cinematic quality 4K
and the
cameras, right?
phone, you can actually now edit the videos on the phone. Like, I mean, you can
Some
actually
of my
do
YouTube
full.
videos I
It's
have
insanity.
shot, edited, and uploaded out where I was.
Yeah,
That's
that's crazy.
sci-fi. I mean, that was science fiction when I was
And
young.
so there's no way. So again, so back to where we sort of started with this. The entire landscape of media that we're looking at now has shifted. We're shifting away from the television channel, which we know is happening as cable is losing subscribers. People are shifting to streaming packages. I mean, we know that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big shift. Is the whole streaming world, trying to sort of
The
figure out.
explosion of piracy and the easy accessibility of things from, like, I remember one of my favorite authors, Jim Butcher. His stuff is awesome. Go pay for it. Go buy it. I've paid for his
The
books in
Dresden Files are the
audio,
best.
hard copy, and digital form. Um, but we went to one of his book signings, and I remember him saying, "Thank you to everyone who was there, because I know you could have gotten my book for free, and you
Mm-hmm.
chose to come and buy it."
Yeah,
And I remember that being very impactful when he said that, and I was just like, "Wow."
yeah.
Because
Well, there is something to be said for the idea. I mean, it's the capitalist idea of speaking with your wallet, and
yeah,
that is why there are things where, again, like with Butcher, where it's like, or even I will get audiobooks of books where, like, I know how to get this without paying for it, but I want to
yeah,
give you my money because I want to support you so that you give me more content in the future. And I think I think we can talk about this on another one, but I think AI is going to sort of mess that up in some
it is.
significant
Well,
way.
it's the writing strike is
Well,
is
and I
happening
don't.
right now.
We'll do that on
We
another one.
we just see it. It's already being disruptive. So
It's
you
already
don't think
happening.
it's going to be. It is.
But what I'm sort of getting at is that I think we need to, I wonder if we are underestimating. I look at this from the political aspect. Let me sort of frame my argument here. Um, I heard a news report on the Hill Rising where they were talking about RFK Jr. and just sort of like that, sort of the 20% of the internet that is interested in him, and sort of that idea. and
Mm-hmm.
and and I wonder if we're I think we're all underestimating
Yeah.
how many people have shifted the way that they get their information. And I don't, whether
They've
it's
either
RFK or
shifted.
not.
They've either shifted or supplemented how they get
Yes.
information. And
And
even
so,
someone like my dad, who
yeah.
watches something on the news and will see a news story and go, that's interesting. Let me go look for it. And
Mhm.
it can also backfire, because there's this thing I get emails on. I think it's Quora, where
Yeah. It's a
where
question and answer
somebody
site.
puts a
Yeah.
question and the most popular answer gets voted to the top. And I've had several times where my dad has said, "Have you heard about this? And this is what is happening with this, and this is the thing now," because he thinks that's a news site.
Right.
And I go dig into it, and I'm like, that's not what's actually happening. That's someone's opinion on what's happening, and it's the most popular answer. But that doesn't mean it's true.
Right.
So,
Well,
and there were
and so
people who were talking about that with Facebook, right? For the fake news and the whole concept and rise of that kind of thing.
right.
Um, yeah, I forgot where I was going with it, but
Well, so where I was going with this is that what we're looking at is this shift, and I wonder if it's not bigger than we think it is. If
mm-hmm.
more people, like you said, have either shifted or supplemented with more information. And so I look at like what RFK is doing. It's just because it's sort of the best example right now.
Well, and the way he's doing it.
And I like him. I'll just I support. I'm supportive of his hopefully
He's been fascinating to listen to. But the man realized he was going to be closed out by the standard media, and so he basically did a podcast tour.
Well, and I liked what he said. I think it was his interview with Peterson, where he talked about like, I'm essentially doing what my uncle did. Kennedy utilized television
mm-hmm.
for the first time in a presidential campaign, like nobody had ever
and
done
that's
before.
Fascinating, because the Nixon-Kennedy debates, anyone who listened to that debate on radio
thought Nixon
overwhelmingly thought Nixon won.
Mm-hmm.
And anyone who watched that debate on television overwhelmingly thought Kennedy won, because Nixon was sweating physically.
Oh, interesting.
That's what they've broken it down to. It was really hot, and for whatever reason, Kennedy didn't sweat, and Nixon was sweating, and that made him look untrustworthy. We later found out that he was, but that's a side thing, right?
Maybe it wasn't as hot as we thought it was.
Exactly.
But I think, but looking at what RFK Jr. is doing, he went on a podcast tour and just hit everything. He went on
he's
comedy
not the only
podcasts
one. And Ice-T, Ice-T, it just did Rogan, and he said on Rogan that he's doing a podcast tour because the mainstream sports media won't talk to him about his alternative basketball league that he's part of, which I had no idea he was even.
I didn't either.
I didn't know there was an alternative basketball league. Like, I didn't know. And he said, so I'm going to go on a podcast tour, and I'm going to talk to anybody who'll have me. So, to get the word out.
Because and I think there are people who are recognizing that this is a new and different medium that we have available,
and it's evolving as we speak, because when I started listening to podcasts and you started listening to podcasts, they were audio only.
Right.
And the first one I remember having video was like, you were like, did you listen to the Rogan or did you watch the Rogan podcast? And I went, I listened to it. And you're like, no, there's video.
Well, there was always video.
I know, but I didn't know that like early on when I first tried to listen to one of them. I went to my podcast player that wasn't Spotify at the time, and it just played audio. And you're like, no, you can go watch it. And you sent me like a YouTube clip. And at the time, he was still on YouTube because he wasn't exclusive yet. So, like, and when we started, our first couple of them didn't have any video because we were figuring it out. And we're like, wow, we can do video. This is... So,
well, we found this app that lets us do it. We use Riverside, which is spectacular.
Yes.
But, this is a custom tool that was built for this, to fill this niche.
Evolving medium. Yeah.
And so, I mean, I just, it's...
I'm amazed how we got here. I'm amazed to see where we're going to be in 5 years.
I don't think I could have told you we were going to be here 5 years ago.
No, no. The idea that you and I
shifted on to the internet almost completely.
Well, or that you and I could be doing a podcast and afford the equipment to do it, right?
Right.
And I'm amazed to see where it's going to go when Apple drops its Vision Pro.
And the Oculus as well,
yeah, and just in general, I've been in the tech world so long that I don't care about tech anymore. I don't get excited about it, but when they showed, and if you, I don't care if you like Apple or not, go watch just the bit where they talk about the hardware that's going into that and the fact that they took a powerful computer and put it into something that will fit on your head and
Yeah.
have shrunk it down. And I remember like things like the Newton and the 12-pound portables and all that stuff. So
Well, remember Palm Pilots, man?
yeah,
Those
no, I remember
were
Palm Pilots. I remember all that
amazing
stuff.
at
I
the
had a Palm
time.
Pilot because that was my first like digital organizer.
Yeah,
I,
same
I
here.
digitally organized my life that way. Um, I remember buying my first computer. I remember my family buying it for it. But the point I was getting at with that is we're amazed what we can do with our phone right now. But imagine walking around with that on your head potentially, being able to watch something move with a head view, edit on the fly, or being uploading on the fly
Mm.
with your hands free.
Well, and
I
I
mean,
I go. You're going recording. I go
no, I'm
think
talking like
about.
live streaming.
But I mean, I think about taking in media at that
Mm-hmm.
point. Like, imagine we move to the level of like we're not just watching the Joe Rogan show. You put a couple of the right kind of cameras in there, and then you can just be in the room. You can sit in the third chair and
Let me take it a
and
step
and
further. Let me take it a step further. Imagine walking down the street with your little news thing going on and them going, this event happened. And you go around and go, hey, that's not what's really going on. Live stream while you're watching something like, or adding a different
Mhm.
perspective to it, or it is going on. And it just, it's mind blowing of the possibilities that are in there. And you're right. It's not just the Vision Pro, the Oculus, and all the, and it's going to start an explosion the same way the iPhone. There were smartphones before the iPhone, right? Let's the
There
Blackberries
was
were out.
BlackBerry.
There was the Windows Phone because I was selling Windows phones when I was in grad school working at Staples.
Was the
So
Windows Phone
there
before
were
the iPhone?
yes, they just sucked. They were just horrible. Um,
Huh. Yeah, you're right.
yeah, I know I'm right. I sold
Oh
them.
yeah, because when on the keynote, it was the Moto Q, the BlackBerry, the
Uh,
Palm Treo, and the Nokia
yeah,
E60.
so
Yeah,
there were other smartphones
I had forgotten about
before
that.
the iPhone, but and if you've never watched it, you should go back and watch just the snippet where Steve Jobs introduces the initial iPhone because he goes, "It's an iPod, it's a
No,
phone, it
it's a
it's a
music
phone."
player,
No,
and
he
it's a
actually
web
said
browser.
no, that's not what he said. He said it's a phone, it's an iPod, and it's an internet connectivity device. And I remember going, "What the hell is an internet connectivity device?" Because he had seen 5 steps forward,
Yeah,
right? Because when I thought about it, I thought, well, it'll have a web browser on it. That's what that means. Or maybe I can get my email. But how many apps now on Android and iPhone have full internet connectivity without you traditionally going to the internet, right?
yeah.
Um, but I think these vision things, now that they've worked the kinks out, and Google tried, let's be honest, Google tried first with the Google glasses, and it just wasn't there yet,
It
right?
was too soon. They were
It was
too far ahead.
too soon, too far ahead, not enough battery life. They hadn't worked the kinks out, but you know what? They took a swing for the fences, and sometimes you miss. Okay, cool.
I
No big
also
deal.
think I also think people people were not ready for that level of connectivity because I remember the big thing
Yes.
being like someone could look up your Facebook while they were talking to you and figure out who you are and deceive you,
There's
and
like a YouTube video where some dude is like doing that with contacts to like
it was
convince
a
a girl to sleep with
simulation.
him or something. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean
it
it
wasn't
was a
real, but
this could happen type thing if this
yeah.
technology keeps going this
And
way.
I think it was too soon. And I think people didn't understand what its
Yeah,
capability was.
yeah.
I think that happens a lot. I remember when for example, when Apple announced their like they were going to try and combat child pornography by doing this thing, and like
Oh, and
everybody
everybody
lost their
lost their
mind, and I was
stuff.
like, I went and read it, and I was like, oh, nobody explained this right.
Yeah,
Like
and I was like,
that's
you didn't,
you know,
you don't
and so
understand
I
what they're
think
actually
that's what
trying to
happened to the
do.
Google Glass is that people
Yeah.
thought it was going to do one thing, and they were like, "Well,
Well,
yeah,
that
it'll
and the
do that in
hardware
like
wasn't there.
10 years."
I think I think Google Glass was like the Newton. The hardware wasn't there yet.
Well, I think what happened is that they were trying to put out a version 1 beta to get the ball rolling. I would use the example of other companies putting like sensor packages onto phones to develop them years before using, like they put stuff into the
Yeah.
phone that they use in the watches now that they
Yeah.
developed in the
Yeah.
phone. I think they were trying to like, let's put out a version 1 so we can start working on it, and it had 4 features. And what happened is people were like, they sort of said, look at all the things that it might be able to do. And people just went, "Ah," and it didn't do any of that stuff. And so then they
Yeah.
had to stop. They couldn't,
Well, I
they
think there's
wanted to put it in the field and
and
they
there's
couldn't.
a whole bunch involved that we have no idea
Yeah,
about. So, but it was too early. The same
it
way
was.
the Newton was too early. And for those who don't know what the Newton is basically a '90s iPad, right? That's basically what it was.
If you go and watch For All Mankind on the Apple TV Plus
No
channel,
spoilers.
no spoilers.
Yeah.
In season 2, it's in the 80s, and just due to the change to different timeline, the
It's like '92. I think it's '92.
no, it's in the. Oh, I don't know,
It's in the night.
matter.
Anyway, it doesn't matter. There's Newtons.
But the Newton is the actual phone because it took off. It worked
took off.
in that universe.
Yeah, it worked. Yeah,
because the tech is better.
I also love that they don't have email; they have D-mail because it's digital mail,
it was
right?
digital because it came out in the 80s when everything was digital instead of electronic.
Yeah. But it's going to be fascinating to see where this ride takes us.
It's shifting now, and I think what's interesting is that unlike the shift with the printing press and the shift with radio and the shift with television, which was sort of like there was a big shift and then it just sort of trickled out over time as people adopted and then like the VHS came out and but like it was long. The TV came out and the TV hasn't really changed.
TV came out and it stayed the same till it went color, and then
fair enough.
But then it stayed the same.
And then they got
it went
bigger
flat
and
screen.
thinner.
Yeah, I mean, and the fundamental, and then there was a change that happened on the back end that not a lot of people are aware of. Is they retired the old signal, and they went to a digital type signal that goes farther. So your old rabbit ear TVs don't work anymore. You have to have.
I remember that happened.
Yeah. So there have been some changes, but they were slow. But technology is screaming forward at an ever evolving and faster pace.
Yeah, it's been picking up steam since the Industrial Revolution, which I didn't really intend to say steam, but and we've reached a point now where it's spinning, the wheel is spinning so fast that the next change is starting before the last one has a chance to even finish.
I have one barometer, and soon I'm going to have a second because I'm using my 18-year-old as one of my barometers to kind of see where it is. But my 8-year-old really doesn't consume a lot of news. And I limit what he can watch streaming, right? So he doesn't have a lot of choices there. But it's I mean, the way he's getting introduced to this stuff is different than the way my 18-year-old was introduced. And I'll give you a perfect example. I bought the Baby Einstein and the Little Einstein DVDs for my 18-year-old when he was a child. I streamed them for my 8-year-old when he was a child.
It's just different. Yeah. Man, VHS to DVD to it's I want to talk point one last thing.
Beta and Laserdisc
because we're running long on this. I read an article and I can't remember if you sent it to me and you may have, about how we're losing video games. The old video games.
I haven't even gotten to read the article, but I sent it to you. It was like 87% of video games are pirated or
the
abandonware.
The only way to I read the article. So the only way to play a game legitimately is sometimes to travel to where it is. because it can only be gotten by stealing it. There's no way to get it, and so the idea that the example that they gave was, imagine if the only way that you could watch the Titanic movie was on a VHS tape.
And I'll give you an even better example.
That's the one from the article.
The only way to watch the first IMAX documentary movie, which was on the Alamo, is to go to San Antonio to the Alamo Mall complex and watch that movie there because it's not offered anywhere else. And it's one of the
Yeah.
best like bio doc or not bio documentary. What is it when it's not a real docu movie?
Biopic?
No, docu movie. Like it's a documentary movie, but it's
Yeah.
not really a biopic because it's about a whole bunch of people. A historical documentary. There we go. A historical docudrama. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
It's a docudrama about the Alamo, but you can only watch it 4 times a day at the IMAX across the street from the Alamo complex.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
So it so I mean, so what they were getting at was that, looking at different ways, that we need other ways to preserve this stuff. And
Yeah.
so just sort of laying that on top of the idea that, like, as this is shifting, are we gonna lose
And
stuff? What's that
and we're
gonna look
seeing the
like?
rise of places like Steam and GOG.com that are resurrecting some of these older games that they can get the licenses for, but some
Yeah.
stuff is abandonware, and the license
It's
is in
just gone.
limbo, or the license is in limbo, and a lot
Mhm.
of times the source code is out there. And I'll give you a series that I love. The MechWarrior series
Mhm.
is fascinating, and I loved it. I played it forever, and if I didn't have the DVDs or the CDs,
Yeah.
it's abandonware. There's no way for me to go
Yeah.
legitimately get that game.
Well, and even now, as we're moving forward, where games are server based,
Mm-hmm.
the one that they called that in the article was City of Heroes, which I remember being a big game. Like, somebody put together a private City of Heroes server so people could log into it, and someone was able to restart it. But I remember there was
Star Wars
a
Galaxies.
Marvel game that I played. It was like a top down kind of like Diablo style. It was just really fun, and they were
Oh
just like,
yeah,
"Yeah, we're not going to do
I
it anymore,"
remember
and they
because
just shut it.
it lasted like 4 or 5 months, and they were like, "Yeah, this is too expensive. We're not making any money, so it's gone."
Well, no, it actually was much longer. It
Was
had
it?
been able to be
Okay.
played on the computer for like a year or two, and then
Oh,
they tried to
okay.
launch it onto the Xbox and the PlayStation, and then it was on
But I
for
remember
five
that
or six or
I remember that
it was
game. It was a
fast,
blast. It was fun, and then it was just gone
and
overnight.
it was just gone,
And
and they
and,
were
and
just like, "Sorry, we're not gonna."
it was a pay to play game. Like you could buy
It
stuff in it,
was,
and the money
yeah,
just poofed. Star Wars Galaxies, and I think Star Wars Galaxies is a little unique in that they told everybody it was sunsetting, and they did an event. They had like a run
yeah.
up to the end, and there are videos out there of the people who had become close friends doing things like having the countdown clock so they could go to hyperspace as the game died. So it was like
Yeah.
the movie ended as they were going off to another adventure. And
But I mean, and think about that though. The game, we're creating worlds and then ending them.
and I have actively not engaged in a significant amount of these games because I want a static, standalone story game. And I'll give you
Yeah.
an example. I love Knights of the Old Republic. I
Mhm.
love Knights of the Old Republic 2. I would never play the online version. And it's because I tried World of Warcraft and I
Yeah.
hated it because it required me to fully immerse myself in the game. I had to interact with other players. And I wanted no part of that because I liked Warcraft and Warcraft 2 and Warcraft 3. I mean, those were the games that I played. I grew up with standalone. I don't have to play something with somebody else. I want the story. I want the encapsulated game. And if I want to play cooperatively, we'd go down to the arcade and we'd put quarters in and play an arcade game, you know.
Yeah.
But I'm old, right? And I just didn't get into that stuff.
And we've gotten wildly off topic. So let's go
But all
ahead
this
and
is media. All this is
it
media, and
is.
it's changed
It is. We've also gone an hour
way
and a half.
long.
So
So yeah,
we'll cap it there. But let us know. Jump in the comments or
shoot us
respond
an email,
on Spotify or tweet at us or whatever.
or
All the
comment
links are
on
down
YouTube.
below.
We
Um,
have a Discord thing.
but let us know, what do you think is this changing landscape? What do you think's coming next? What are you excited about? What are you worried about?
What are you holding on to?
Yeah.
Yeah.